At Cresmer Veterans Academy, Walter Bradock, the overlooked gate guard, notices subtle signs of a breach: flickering cameras, disturbed dirt, bent branches. Dismissed as a relic by cocky Lieutenant Myers and joking cadets, Walter's meticulous logs and quiet vigilance go ignored. As tension builds, he delivers a detailed report to General Whitmore, but it's buried in bureaucracy. One stormy night, the campus blacks out, chaos erupts, and intruders slip through. Walter, armed with instinct and an old revolver, tracks their path alone. His chilling words to the late-arriving SWAT team, "You're late, they're already gone," hint at a deeper, unresolved mystery. If Walter's story inspired you, join us in honoring unsung heroes. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with friends. Drop your thoughts below. Do you know a quiet guardian like Walter? Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching and standing with us. At Cresmer Veterans Academy, Walter Bradock was little more than a fleeting silhouette against the evening mist, a figure who materialized at the back gate as the sun dipped below the horizon and vanished before the first rays of dawn. To the bustling world of cadets and officers, he was an enigma, a relic who seemed to belong to another time. Nobody knew where he lived or how he arrived at the academy each night. He simply appeared, thermos clutched in one weathered hand, clipboard in the other, wearing a threadbare security jacket with a name patch, W. Bradock, stitched unevenly over the breast. The cadets, brimming with youthful energy and bravado, dubbed him the Ghost. It wasn't a name born of fear. Walter carried no air of menace. Rather, it stemmed from indifference, a casual dismissal of a man who seemed to fade into the background of their noisy, ambitious lives. He was quiet, too quiet for a place pulsing with the clamor of young men and women eager to prove themselves. Unlike the officers who barked commands or strutted with walkie-talkies, Walter issued no orders, wrote no citations, and often didn't even bother with a flashlight. He simply watched, his gaze steady and unyielding, as if he saw something the rest of them couldn't. Every evening, without fail, Walter arrived at Gate 4, the least used entrance, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the campus. It was a place where the fence sagged slightly, where the lights flickered with age, and where the world seemed to hold its breath. His routine was unchanging, almost ritualistic. He walked the perimeter not once but twice, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. He tested every latch with a gentle tug, his fingers lingering as if confirming some unspoken truth. His eyes flicked upward to each dim street lamp, noting their faint glow, and without fail, he paused at the southeast corner of the fence for exactly 10 seconds. No one knew why. That pause, that deliberate stillness, was a mystery that hung in the air, like the fog that often cloaked the academy grounds. To the younger cadets, it was fodder for mockery. "Bet he's saluting some Confederate general," one sneered over dinner, sparking a round of laughter. "That thermos of his, probably older than the barracks," another added, grinning. Even the officers, in their private moments, couldn't resist. Over steaming mugs of coffee, Lieutenant Logan Myers once remarked, "Bradock's like a lawn statue with a security badge." The room erupted in chuckles, the kind that linger like smoke. Walter, for his part, never acknowledged the jabs. Not when they first began, not when they echoed through the corridors as he passed, not even when someone slipped a pair of glossy retirement brochures under his clipboard one chilly evening. He simply carried on, his silence louder than their laughter. Walter's work was meticulous, almost sacred in its precision. He logged every patrol in a neat, handwritten script, each entry free of abbreviations or errors. He noted the weather conditions, temperature, wind speed, cloud cover, with the care of a man documenting history. His logbook was a testament to his unwavering commitment, a record much by the chaos of the academy around him. He never missed a shift, not even when storms roared through the grounds, when the wind howled like a mournful spirit and rain lashed the earth. On those nights, Walter stood resolute by the guard booth, his collar turned up against the gale, his eyes fixed on the swaying trees. To most, he was invisible, a figure so unassuming he might as well have been part of the fence itself. But to a select few, he was something more, something they couldn't quite name. Cadet Ellen McCrae was one of those few. From her first week at Cresmer, Walter left an impression that refused to fade. Out of instinct, she had saluted him on her third day, her arms snapping up in a gesture of respect she hadn't fully understood. Walter returned it, not with the lazy flick of a hand she'd seen from others, nor with the playful exaggeration of a superior humoring a rookie, but with a crisp, deliberate motion that spoke of decades of discipline. That moment stayed with her, a quiet spark in the back of her mind. She began to watch him, not out of curiosity, but out of a growing sense that there was more to Walter than the Academy's jokes suggested. She noticed the way he logged the weather with a reverence that seemed out of place in a world of digital reports and automated systems. She saw how he studied the camera feeds, his eyes tracing the grainy images as if they held secrets only he could decipher. His movements weren't slow as the others claimed, but deliberate, each step carrying the weight of purpose. Walter never offered advice, never regaled anyone with tales of battles fought or wars won, never interrupted the cadets' chatter. Yet there was something about him, a quiet authority that didn't demand attention but commanded it all the same. Ellen began to suspect that Walter wasn't forgotten by choice, but by design. He was watching something the rest of them were too loud, too distracted, to see about. In the months that followed, Ellen's observations deepened into a quiet respect. She saw how the academy thrived on noise, cadets shouting to be noticed, officers barking to be obeyed, but Walter operated it in the spaces between. He didn't speak unless it mattered, and when he did, his words carried a weight that lingered long after they were spoken. She began to wonder about the man behind the thermos and the clipboard, about the life that had shaped him into someone who could stand so still, so silent, and yet see so much. Her thoughts often drifted to that pause at the southeast corner, those 10 seconds of stillness that seemed to hold a story no one else cared to ask about. What was he remembering? What was he guarding against? Well, Ellen didn't know, but she felt certain that Walter Bradock was more than a gate guard. He was a sentinel, a keeper of something the Academy had forgotten. Lieutenant Logan Myers, on the other hand, saw Walter through a very different lens. At 32, Myers was the Academy's golden boy, a man whose voice could cut through concrete and whose ego filled every room he entered. Fresh off his third commendation in as many years, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed he'd earned every inch of his authority. Young, sharp, and steeped in textbook protocol, Myers valued two things above all else: speed and strength. Anything that didn't fit into those categories was, to him, irrelevant. Walter Bradock was the epitome of irrelevance. Myers couldn't fathom why the Academy kept that old relic on the payroll. Still scribbling in a notebook like it's 1950, he'd scoff, rolling his eyes as he flipped through reports on his tablet. To Myers, Walter was a curiosity at best, a liability at worst. He didn't understand the man's quiet vigilance, his refusal to embrace the efficiency of modern systems. Myers thrived on action, on decisive moves and clear outcomes. Walter's stillness, his methodical pace, grated on him like a misaligned gear. In private, Myers wondered how Walter had ever earned a security clearance, let alone held on to it for so long. To him, the old man was a fossil, a remnant of a bygone era that had no place in the high-stakes world of Cresmer. But all of that changed on the night the campus went dark. It began with a flicker, a brief stutter in the lights that no one thought much of. Then, without warning, the entire academy plunged into blackness. Sirens screamed to life, their wails slicing through the sudden silence. Power failed, systems crashed, and the cadets, trained for order, descended into chaos, their voices overlapping in a frantic cacophony. Officers shouted commands that went unheard, their authority drowned out by the panic. Outside, the rain poured in relentless sheets, turning the grounds into a slick, treacherous maze. As the SWAT team arrived, their boots pounding against the pavement, they expected to take charge, to restore order with their shisai and firepower. But they weren't prepared for what they found at Gate 4. Walter Bradock stood there, untouched by the chaos, his silhouette sharp against the storm. He stepped out of the shadows, rain streaming down his face, and faced the team, men half his age, twice his size, with a calm that bordered on defiance. His voice, when he spoke, was low but piercing, cutting through the roar of the rain and the wail of the sirens. "You're late," he said. "They're already gone." 5 words, delivered with such certainty that the SWAT team froze, their weapons half raised, their confidence shaken. In that moment, Walter was no longer the ghost, no longer the old man at the fence. He was something else entirely. A soldier, the last true soldier, standing resolute when everyone else had faltered. To Ellen, who watched from a distance, her heart pounding in her chest, it was a revelation. The man she'd saluted on instinct, the man she'd studied in silence, had been waiting for this moment all along. His quiet vigilance, his unchanging routine, his pause at the southeast corner, they weren't quirks or relics of age. They were the actions of a man who had never stopped fighting, who had never stopped watching. To Myers, who stood soaked and stunned among the SWAT team, it was a humbling blow. The old man he'd mocked, the fossil he'd dismissed, had seen what he couldn't. Walter Bradock wasn't just a gate guard. He was the Academy's last line of defense, a shadow that had held its ground when the world fell apart. And as the rain continued to fall, Ellen and Myers both knew they would never see him the same way again. In the bustling mess hall one crisp morning, Lieutenant Myers let out a scoff that echoed across 3 tables, sharp enough to cut through the chatter of the cadets. What's next for old Walter? Morse code, smoke signals. His voice dripped with mockery, and the room erupted in laughter. To the cadets, it was just another jab in their ongoing game of poking fun at Walter Bradock, the aging guard who seemed to belong to another era. A few mimicked his slow, deliberate walk, each step measured like the tick of a metronome. One cadet, grinning, pretended to sip from an imaginary thermos, while another quipped about reserving a rocking chair for Gate 4. The jabs were relentless, but harmless in their minds. After all, Walter never reacted. Every evening, without fail, he arrived at precisely 6 p.m., his boots clicking softly on the pavement. He'd nod to the gate officer, check his logbook with a quiet reverence, and take his post in silence. To the cadets, he was an easy target, a relic who didn't belong in their fast-paced, tech-driven world. But the jokes grew sharper, their edges honed by a creeping disdain. During a training session, someone sneered, "He probably thinks satellite surveillance is witchcraft." Another chimed in, "I bet he used to guard a payphone back in the day." It wasn't just the words that stung, it was the tone, dismissive and condescending, as if Walter wasn't a man who had served faithfully, but a fossil who had outstayed his welcome. To them, he was a leftover, a curiosity from a bygone time, out of step with the sleek efficiency of modern security. Yet Walter never flinched. His face, weathered but composed, betrayed no hint of offense. He simply turned the page in his logbook, his pen moving with the same steady precision it always had, recording the world as he saw it. Lieutenant Myers, however, wasn't content with subtle jabs. He made a spectacle of his disdain. One night during his inspection rounds, he strode up to Walter's booth with a swagger, his boots heavy on the ground. He rapped twice on the glass, the sound sharp like a hammer's on a fish tank. "You awake in there, old man," he said, a grin curling his lips. "We've got real security work to do, not just scribbling notes and sipping coffee." The words hung in the air, laced with mockery, but Walter didn't so much as blink. He turned another page in his logbook, his movements calm, deliberate, and jotted down a note. That was his way, never arguing, never correcting, only recording. Behind him, on a shelf in the booth, dozens of notebooks stood in neat rows, each filled with meticulous observations. Patrol, logs, wind patterns, camera blind spots, cadet behaviors, all cataloged with exacting detail. Dates, themes, names. To Walter, the world was a puzzle of patterns, and his pen was the tool that pieced it together. Ellen McCrae saw something in Walter that the others missed. From her first week at the base, she had saluted him every evening, not because protocol demanded it or because he expected it, but because something in his quiet dignity compelled her. It wasn't just his service record, though she knew he'd served longer than most of them had been alive. It was the way he carried himself, steady, unyielding, like a lighthouse weathering a storm. Each evening he returned her salute with a crisp, clean motion, no smile, no words, just a quiet acknowledgement that spoke of respect earned through years of unseen devotion. Ellen felt it in her bones. Walter wasn't just a guard, he was a sentinel, guarding not just the gate but something deeper, something the others were too young or too brash to understand. One night, as Myers lobbed another barb, something about Walter's Civil War tactics, Ellen caught a fleeting moment that shifted her perception. She was standing nearby, her eyes drifting toward Walter Ball's booth, when she saw it. His pen, mid-note, paused for a single heartbeat. It didn't tremble, didn't falter. It simply stopped, as if the world had held its breath. Then, just as quickly, it resumed its steady scratch across the page. That pause, so brief it could have been missed, told her everything. Walter heard it all, the bumps, the laughter, the condescension. He wasn't deaf to their words, nor was he indifferent, but he chose silence, not out of weakness, but out of strength. He wasn't listening for insults. He was listening for patterns, sifting through the noise of their mockery to find the signals that mattered. In a place where bravado and technology reigned, Walter had made silence his armor, observation his weapon. To the others, Walter's methods were laughably outdated. His slow walks, his handwritten logs, his refusal to embrace the sleek digital systems, they saw it as stubbornness, a refusal to evolve. But Ellen saw something else: purpose. Walter wasn't just watching the gates, he was watching everything: the cadence of footsteps, the shift of shadows, the way a cadet's eyes darted during a late-night patrol. He saw what they missed because they were too busy chasing speed and efficiency. Respect, Walter knew, didn't come from a title or a rank. It came from what you chose to see and what you chose to let pass. And Walter saw everything. By mid-October, a subtle change crept into the air. The wind carried a colder bite, whispering through the pine trees that lined the perimeter fence. Most barely noticed, their minds on drills and deadlines, but Walter Bradock felt it. He always did. Something was off, an itch at the edges of his routine that refused to be ignored. At 2:03 a.m. on a Wednesday, the southeast quadrant camera flickered. Twice, a brief hiccup in the feed. Most would have dismissed it as a glitch, a voltage surge, or a tired circuit. But Walter froze the footage, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer to the grainy screen. In the frame, a branch that had always hung straight now sagged slightly, bent at an angle so subtle it could have been a trick of the light. He rewound the tape once, then twice, his fingers steady on the controls. The live feed confirmed it. The branch was still bent, its angle deliberate, unnatural. That afternoon, Walter walked the southeast fence line, his steps slow and measured, counting the distance from the back access road to the tree line. The air felt heavy, charged with something he couldn't yet name. At the base of the fence, the dirt was disturbed. Not torn, no footprints or drag marks, but the leaves were unsettled, their pattern disrupted. A small chunk of bark had been peeled from a post. The wound fresh, its edges still raw. Back in his booth, Walter pulled the surveillance logs from the past 5 nights. At 1:47 a.m., 2 nights earlier, another flicker in the same quadrant. No movement, no sound, just a subtle blink. The next night, at 3:12 a.m., the same. Patterns, always patterns. Walter didn't leap to conclusions. He wasn't a man driven by impulse or ego. Instead, he documented every flicker, every angle, every shift in the leaves. His pen moved across the page, capturing the details with the precision of a cartographer mapping uncharted land. To him, the world was a series of signals, and his job was to listen, to watch, to understand. While the others mocked at his slowness, his silence, his odds, Walter Bradock was doing what he had always done, seeing what they could not, hearing what they ignored, and guarding what they took for granted. Walter Bradock stood alone in the dim glow of the security booth, his weathered hands meticulously recording the night's environmental data. The wind howled faintly outside, its speed and direction noted with precision in his small, leather-bound notebook. He jotted down the temperature, a subtle drop that prickled his instincts, though he couldn't yet name why. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle only he seemed to see. When the report was finished, he printed it with care, the hum of the old printer filling the quiet. He slid the crisp pages into a manila folder, its edges worn from years of similar deliveries. and made his way through the drizzle to the command office. His boots crunched softly on the gravel path, each step deliberate, as if he carried something heavier than paper. Captain Reeds was absent, as Walter had half expected. A young lieutenant, barely out of training, lounged behind the desk, his eyes glazed with the indifference of someone who saw reports as mere busy work. He took the folder with a half-hearted nod, treating it like a discarded menu from the mess hall. Walter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He offered a single nod, sharp and final, and turned back into the damp evening. Inside, a flicker of frustration stirred. He'd spent hours on that report, cross-referencing patterns no one else seemed to notice. But he buried the feeling, as he always did, and walked away. By the next evening, the silence was deafening. No follow-up came. No inspection crew was dispatched. The southeast camera feed still flickered at odd intervals, always between 11 o'clock p.m. and 3:00 a.m., always pointing to the same shadowy corner of the academy's perimeter. Walter sat at his post, the grainy monitor casting a pale glow across his face. The flicker wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like a signal meant to go unseen. He leaned closer, his breath steady, but his pulse quickening. Something was out there, and it wasn't just his imagination. On Friday, during the evening briefing, Lieutenant Myers sauntered past Walter's station, his lips curled into a smug grin that radiated condescension. "Still out there chasing shadows, Bradock?" he called, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby cadets. He paused for effect, tapping his chin theatrically. "What was it again? Oh, right, bent twigs and squirrel espionage." The cadets erupted into laughter, their voices sharp and mocking, one mime tiptoeing with exaggerated claws, while another stage whispered, "Lock down the academy! The rodents are mobilizing!" The room buzzed with their amusement, but Walter remained still, his clipboard balanced on one knee. His eyes stayed fixed on the page before him, his pen moving in slow, deliberate strokes. The laughter didn't touch him, though each jeer landed like a stone in his chest. He flipped the page and wrote another note, the scratch of ink a quiet defiance. Myers' grin faltered. Walter's silence unnerved him, as if the older man's calm was a mirror reflecting Myers' own pettiness. "What are you scribbling now, huh?" Meyer pressed, stepping closer. "Ghost stories? Do us all a favor, old man, and stick to gate duty. Leave the real threats to us." His tone dripped with scorn, but Walter didn't flinch. His hand kept its rhythm, the pen a lifeline to his purpose. Inside, though, a quiet anger simmered, not at Meyer, but at the dismissal of something he knew was real. He'd seen too many signs to doubt himself now. Cadet Ellen McCrae stood at the edge of the group, her arms crossed tightly. She didn't laugh or smirk like the others. Walter's stillness, his refusal to rise to Meyer's bait, sent a chill through her. There was something in his focus, a weight that made her stomach twist. She'd heard the rumors about Bradock's ghosts, but now she wondered if they were more than just stories. Later that night, long after the dormitory lights had dimmed, Ellen passed the security booth on her way to the communications building. The blinds were half drawn, but she glimpsed Walter inside, hunched over the monitor. He was replaying the camera footage frame by frame, his eyes narrowed with intensity. The screen flickered, and in the corner of the frame, something moved. Not a blur, not an animal, but a deliberate shift, just beyond the sensor's range. Walter froze the image, his fingers adjusting the contrast until a faint footprint emerged, barely visible but undeniable. Ellen's breath caught, goosebumps prickling her arms. She stepped back from the window, her heart racing. Walter never looked up, but she felt the weight of his vigilance, a solitary guard against something no one else was ready to face. Walter had been patient, perhaps too patient. After the third unexplained flicker in a week of subtle anomalies, he decided to act. Reports to the command office weren't enough. They vanished into the bureaucracy like whispers in a storm. So he drafted a new document, this time typed but signed by hand, 4 pages of meticulous detail. He included 3 grainy photos, taped carefully inside, and a diagram on the final page. The diagram mapped blind zones between cameras, charting interference patterns and predicted breach points, each marked in red ink with his precise handwriting. Every line reflected hours of sleepless nights, every note a testament to his growing unease. He sealed the document in a tan envelope, scrawling, "To General Sarah Whitmore, personal review on the front. This wasn't for the lieutenant's desk or a general inbox. It was for someone who might listen. He carried the envelope to the main admin building, his steps heavy with purpose. He avoided Lieutenant Meyer, knowing the younger man would only mock him further. Instead, he found Sergeant Alicia Monroe, General Whitmore's personal aide, during her lunch break. "Just make sure she sees this," he said, his voice low but firm. Monroe's brow furrowed, sensing the urgency beneath his calm. "Sure thing, Mr. Bradock," she replied, tucking the envelope under her arm. Walter nodded and walked back into the drizzle, the weight on his shoulders lifting slightly. He'd done what he could. Now it was up to someone else to act. That night, the sky grew heavy with clouds, low and oppressive. The wind shifted, blowing sharp from the east, carrying the scent of rain and something metallic, like the edge of a blade. Walter began his patrol earlier than usual, his flashlight cutting through the gathering dark. At 9:47 p.m., he reached the southeast quadrant and crouched near the fence. Earlier that day, he'd placed a small rock as a marker, a subtle test. Now, the rock was shifted, just 2 inches, but enough to confirm his fears. Beneath it, the earth bore fresh boot prints, deeper and wider than his own, with a military tread that didn't match Academy-issued boots. No cadet had reason to be beyond the fence, and no drill was scheduled. Walter's pulse quickened, but his hands were steady as he pulled out his notebook. By the beam of his flashlight, he sketched the print with care, capturing every ridge and detail. Then he stood, his eyes scanning the tree line. It was silent, but the silence felt alive, watching him back. He carried no weapon, only his flashlight and his notebook. But in that moment, they were enough. Whatever was out there, Walter Bradock was ready, or as ready as he could be. Walter Bradock's hands trembled slightly as he added the new sketch to his logbook. The faint scratch of pencil on paper, a quiet rebellion against the stillness of the night. The booth, a cramped ball of concrete and glass, smelled of stale coffee and old wood, its walls lined with meticulously organized reports from weeks past. Each entry was a testament to his vigilance, a record of shadows that moved too freely beyond the fence line of Cresmer Veterans Academy. Tonight his gut churned with unease, a familiar weight that had settled in his chest since the southeast camera flickered at dusk. He'd seen it, a blur, a shape, something that didn't belong. His report, penned with deliberate care, detailed the perimeter breach in sharp, unyielding precision. At 11:22 p.m., he left the booth, the night air biting at his knuckles as he clutched the envelope. He marched to the command office, his boots heavy on the gravel, and handed the report to the night officer, a cadet so young his face still carried the softness of boyhood. The kid barely glanced at the top line, his eyes dull with inexperience, before tossing it into the outbox with a shrug. "No drills tonight, sir. Probably just a gardener or something." Walter's jaw tightened, but he only nodded, slow and deliberate, swallowing the urge to lecture. He knew better than to push. He'd seen this before. Apathy dressed as protocol. Back at his post, the thermos of coffee sat untouched, its warmth long gone. His eyes, sharp despite the years, scanned the shadows beyond the fence, searching for the flicker of movement he knew wasn't random. By 3:10 a.m., when the southeast camera flickered again, Walter's heart thudded with a quiet dread. He logged it, his handwriting steady despite the pulse in his temples. No alarm sounded. No one came. The envelope meant for General Whitmore, the one that might have changed everything, lay buried under a stack of requisition forms on Lieutenant Monroe's desk. She'd forgotten it, her mind tangled in the endless paperwork that defined her days. Monroe, a woman of sharp intellect but scattered focus, had meant to deliver it. She'd even pictured herself handing it to the general, her voice firm with purpose. But the forms, the meetings, the endless demands of the academy had swallowed her intent, leaving the report to gather dust. As the next evening draped itself over the campus, Walter stood at the fence line once more, his breath visible in the chill air. The weight of his thermos hung at his side, ignored. His eyes, weathered but unyielding, traced the edges of the shadows, where moonlight failed to reach. He didn't shout, didn't demand attention. He simply wrote it all down, every missed sign, every ignored warning, every inch of ground an intruder could claim. Walter knew patterns. He'd seen them in wars long past. In moments when hesitation became catastrophe, patterns he'd learned either went unnoticed or came true. He feared this one was the latter. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the world broke. Cresmer Veterans Academy, wrapped in the uneasy quiet of sleep, shattered into darkness. A sharp pop echoed from the main power grid, and then nothing. No lights, no alarms, no hum of surveillance monitors. The emergency generators, gleaming with the pride of recent funding, sat silent, useless. The campus drowned in blackness, and panic erupted. Cadets jolted awake in their bunks, hearts hammering in their chests, the silence heavier than any noise. A scream pierced the air, raw and primal. A metal footlocker crashed to the floor, its clang swallowed by the chaos of slamming doors and pounding footsteps. The air buzzed with a single, unspoken truth. This was no drill. Inside the command post, Lieutenant Myers gripped a dead radio, his voice cracking as he shouted into the void. "Where's the damn backup power?" he roared, his frustration masking the fear that clawed at his throat. He was a man built for order, not chaos, and the absence of control left him unraveling. His hands shook as he fumbled with the radio, willing it to crackle to life, but it stayed silent, mocking him. Across the academy, voices fractured in panic. Security teams stumbling through the dark with flashlights that flickered like they, too, were unsure of their purpose. The halls roared with confusion, louder than any siren could have been. But at the west gate, Walter Bradock stood steady. Sleep was a stranger to him on nights like this. When the air hung too still, when the wind carried a warning only he seemed to hear. His instincts, honed by decades of service, stirred like an old wound. He clicked on his flashlight, not the flimsy plastic ones issued by the department, but a heavy, scratched metal relic that had seen him through darker nights than this. Its beam cut through the black, steady and sure. From a storage shelf under his desk, he retrieved something else. An old service revolver, wrapped in oiled cloth, its weight a quiet comfort in his hand. He didn't pause to second guess. Boots laced, hat pulled low, he moved into the darkness with the certainty of a man who'd been trained for it long ago. While others ran toward the noise, Walter sought the silence, his steps deliberate, his senses sharp. He circled the perimeter, cutting through overgrown hedges and ducking beneath a low-hanging drain pipe, his path weaving through the blind spots he'd memorized over years of patrols. At the edge of the mess hall, he stopped. Something was wrong. The back entrance door, always triple-locked, hung slightly ajar. His pulse quickened, but his movement stayed calm. Kneeling, he scanned the ground, his flashlight catching a muddy boot print. Fresh, without wrong. The heel was shallow, the toe deep, as if someone had been running, retreating in haste. Walter's mind raced, piecing together the implications. He crept closer to the doorframe, his light revealing a wiring panel sliced clean, the cut too precise for a prank. This was no cadet stunt, no test. This was calculated, deliberate, dangerous. He holstered the revolver under his jacket, the cold metal grounding him. From his pocket, he pulled a stub of pencil and marked the doorframe with a single deliberate X, a silent signal to himself, a promise to return. He didn't head for the command office, where Myers was likely still shouting at a blank screen. He didn't seek out Monroe, who'd buried his report under her chaos. Instead, Walter turned toward the water tower, its silhouette looming in the dark. If he were the intruder, that's where he'd go next. A blind spot, a shadow to hide in. His steps were quiet, purposeful, driven by a certainty that whatever was coming, he'd meet it head on. At the command post, chaos reigned like a storm breaking over a fragile shore. Cadets clustered in tight knots, their voices a jagged mix of shouts and stifled sobs, each grappling with the weight of the unknown. Fear and confusion hung heavy in the air, thicker than the damp that clung to their uniforms. Some stood frozen, eyes darting for answers that refused to come, while others paced, their boots scuffing the floor as if movement could unravel the night's mystery. Lieutenant Myers, a man whose temper often outran his judgment, stood at the heart of the turmoil, his face a mask of barely contained rage. His frustration erupted in a swift kick that sent men in Pero's chair skidding across the room, its screech cutting through the din. "Where's Bradock?" he bellowed, his voice raw with desperation. "Someone get me Bradock, now!" The demand echoed unanswered, swallowed by the clamor of the cadets and the oppressive silence of the night. Myers' chest tightened, his mind racing with the questions he couldn't voice. How had it come to this? How had they been so blindsided? His authority, usually a shield, felt like a flimsy veil against the chaos. But Walter Bradock was already gone, slipping through the shadows with the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was going. His steps were deliberate, unhurried, as if the darkness itself parted to guide him. In his mind, he carried a map no one else could see, a mental blueprint etched from weeks of silent observation, every detail cataloged with a precision that bordered on obsession. The chaos at the command post was a distant roar now, fading behind him as he moved deeper into the night. Under his breath, he muttered two words heavy with resignation. Too late. The rain began to fall, cold and unrelenting, as if the sky itself were mourning the missed chance. High above, a helicopter's blades thumped uselessly, circling 23 minutes too late to change the outcome. The SWAT trucks roared through Cresmer's east gate, their flashing lights slicing through the downpour like blades of fire. Tires churned the mud, and boots hit the ground with disciplined urgency. Sharp commands pierced the air, rifles sweeping the shadows for threats long gone. The intruders, whoever they were, had melted into the dense trees beyond the water tower, leaving behind only churned earth in a single flickering censer, its weak pulse a mocking reminder of their escape. At the edge of the scene stood Walter Bradock, soaked to the bone, his jacket plastered to his frame like a second skin born of the rain. His hat sat low, shielding eyes that held a quiet, unshakable calm, a calm that had always made others underestimate him. His revolver rested in its holster, untouched, as he stood on the rear access road, not obstructing, but simply waiting, as if the night itself owed him answers. A SWAT captain approached, visor raised, his face a mix of suspicion and exhaustion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the patter of rain. Walter didn't flinch. He raised a weathered notebook, its pages curled and stained from water and wear, and held it out like a silent challenge. "I'm the one who warned you," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of truth. The captain hesitated, then took the notebook, flipping it open to reveal a page dense with handwritten notes, time-stamped movements, breach points, camera downtimes, blind spots, even probable identities pieced together from past footage, weight distribution, and the depth of boot prints in the mud. It was a chronicle of vigilance, weeks of observations mapped out with meticulous care, predicting the intruder's path, their exit, even their method. Manual panel bypass, wire cuts, all laid bare. The captain's breath caught as he scanned the pages, each line a testament to a mind that saw what others missed. Another officer peered over the captain's shoulder, flipping to the back of the notebook. His voice trembled with shock. "There's a name here," he said. "Two, actually." Before the captain could respond, Lieutenant Myers stormed in, his boots slapping puddles, his face flushed with indignation. "Hold it right there," he shouted, pointing at Walter. "He's just a guard. He has no clearance for this." His words dripped with disdain, but beneath them lurked a flicker of doubt, a gnawing fear that he'd misjudged the man standing before him. Walter didn't move, his gaze lifting just once to meet Myers. "You're late," he said softly, the words cutting deeper than any shout. "They're already gone." Myers' mouth opened, but no retort came, only silence, heavy with the weight of his failure. The SWAT captain didn't bother with further questions. He nodded to his team, and they followed Walter's notes like a lifeline, chasing shadows that had already slipped away. Morning crept over Cresmer, slow and reluctant, as if the dawn itself were wary of what it might reveal. Power had been restored, but the academy felt cloaked in a lingering darkness, its halls alive with the whispers of cadets trying to piece together the night's events. The SWAT trucks remained parked near the southern gate, their operators moving in hushed tones, their eyes occasionally drifting to the west fence line where an old man had handed them a map more precise than any satellite feed. Walter's notebook had become a quiet legend, its pages a testament to a vigilance no one had noticed until it was too late. At precisely 0800, a single black SUV rolled through the academy's main entrance, its tinted windows and lack of fanfare a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. No sirens, no convoy, just silence and purpose. Out stepped General Sarah Whitmore, her presence commanding despite the simplicity of her plain uniform, adorned only with the 3 silver stars on her collar. She carried an authority that needed no medals, no ribbons, only the weight of her reputation. The salutes offered as she passed went unacknowledged. Her focus was singular, her steps carrying her directly to the officers' building. Inside, Lieutenant Myers stood in the meeting room, surrounded by jittery junior officers and command aides, his hands flipping through a chaotic pile of incident reports. His voice was mid-sentence, strained with the effort of maintaining control, when the door swung open. The room snapped to attention as Whitmore entered, her expression unreadable, a manila folder clutched in her hand. She said nothing, moving to the front of the room with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the weight of every decision she'd ever made. She placed the folder on the table, opened it, and drew out a single photograph, its edges worn with age. In it, a younger Sarah Whitmore stood in full combat gear, her face set with determination, beside a taller soldier whose uniform bore the dust of Afghan sand. Walter Bradock. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken questions. Whitmore's eyes lingered on the photo, a flicker of memory stirring beneath her stoic exterior. Memories of battles fought, trust forged, and a man whose quiet competence had always been her anchor. Myers' gaze darted between the photo and Walter, his earlier certainty crumbling under the weight of what he now understood. Walter Bradock wasn't just a guard. He was something more, someone who had seen the storm coming long before the first drop fell. The room fell into a stunned hush, the air thick with disbelief. A sharp gasp cut through from the back, followed by a low murmur of, "No way." Commander Whitmore stood at the front, her presence commanding, her eyes piercing through the weight of the moment. She let the silence linger, heavy and deliberate, before her voice sliced through it. For weeks you ignored clear breach patterns. Hard data, undeniable evidence, was right in front of you, and you dismissed it. Worse, you mocked the man who designed the very threat response protocol you were too careless to follow. Her gaze locked onto Lieutenant Myers, who sat rigid, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. Whitmore's finger tapped a worn photograph on the table, the image of a man whose face carried the weight of countless battles. "This man," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury, "was my commanding officer once. He led joint response teams through 3 combat zones, navigating chaos most of you can't even imagine. The rescue logistics you rely on every day in this building? He's the reason they exist." Her words landed like blows, each one stripping away the room's defenses. Myers' face drained of color, his usual confidence crumbling under the weight of her stare. He opened his mouth, voice trembling. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I wasn't informed of his—" "You were informed," Whitmore snapped, cutting him off with surgical precision. "You just didn't listen." She closed the folder in front of her with a deliberate snap, the sound echoing like a gavel. "Effective immediately, Lieutenant Myers. You are relieved of all security oversight. Report to administrative duty until further notice." The room froze. No one dared to breathe, let alone speak. Whitmore's eyes swept across the officers, each one shrinking under her scrutiny. "From this moment forward, every single one of you will read Walter Bradock's report, cover to cover. Memorize it if you have to. This isn't a suggestion." Without another word, she turned and strode out, her boots clicking against the floor with finality. As the door swung shut behind her, the officers exchanged glances, their faces a mix of shock and shame, the weight of their failure settling into their bones. Far across the academy grounds, in the small, unassuming West Guard booth, Walter Bradock sat alone. The same faded uniform hung on his lean frame, the same battered thermos rested by his side, steam curling faintly from its lid. His clipboard, worn and meticulous, lay within reach, its pages filled with notes only he could fully decipher. But something had shifted. Cadets passing by no longer hurried past with indifferent glances. Instead, they slowed, their eyes lingering on the old man. For the first time, they saluted first, their movements hesitant but earnest. Walter didn't acknowledge the gestures with more than a slight nod, his focus fixed on the horizon. He didn't need their recognition. He never had. Yet, in that quiet moment, the air around the booth felt different. charged with a newfound respect, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had been invisible for so long. Walter Bradock was not a man of speeches or grand gestures. He didn't linger for farewell parties or pose for photographs to immortalize his service. So when the West Gate opened one crisp morning and his booth stood empty, no one was truly surprised, but the absence hit like a physical force. His thermos was gone, his clipboard missing. All that remained was a neatly folded jacket draped over the chair, its name patch faded but still legible. Bradock. Taped to the desk beneath it was a single sheet of paper, bearing 6 words in his steady, deliberate handwriting. Guard what they overlook. WBN, no signature, no date, no explanation. Just those words, half instruction, half farewell, left behind like a quiet command etched into the soul of the academy. For the next hour, a steady stream of cadets made their way to the booth. Some stood in silence, their breath visible in the chilly air, staring at the empty chair as if it might summon Walter back. Others reached out, their fingers brushing the jacket's worn fabric, as if touching it could connect them to the man who had become a legend in their midst. Even the officers came, their usual bravado stripped away. They removed their caps instinctively, not because protocol demanded it, but because something deeper compelled them. By noon, the news had spread. Walter Bradock had retired. No ceremony, no medals, no fanfare. Just gone, as quietly as he had lived. That afternoon, a new figure appeared at the West Gate. Cadet Ellen McCrae stood tall, her uniform crisp, her expression resolute. No one had assigned her to the post. No orders had been given. She had simply arrived at precisely 1800 hours, her boots polished, her posture unwavering, and taken up the watch. Her movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, mirroring the habits of the man who had stood there before her. She checked the locks 3 times, walked the fence line with measured steps, and paused at the southeast corner for exactly 10 seconds, her eyes scanning the trees with a vigilance that felt inherited. Tucked inside her vest pocket, zipped tight and close to her heart, was Walter's notebook. It wasn't a prop or a trophy. She studied it, lived by it, its pages a guide to the duty she now carried. At first, the younger cadets whispered among themselves, their brows furrowed in confusion. "She's not security," one muttered. "Why is she standing guard?" But their questions faded quickly. There was something in Ellen's presence, quiet but alert, calm but razor-sharp, that silenced doubts. She stood the way Walter had, her stillness radiating authority, her gaze carrying the weight of someone who understood what was at stake. No one questioned her twice. A week later, a small brass plaque was quietly installed at the gate. Bradock Post, in honor of steadfast watch. That evening, a handful of cadets and officers gathered, their voices low, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Ellen didn't speak. She stood at her post, hands folded behind her back, watching the world the way Walter had. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was enough. Walter hadn't left behind a manual or a set of rules. He had left an example, one that Ellen embodied with every deliberate step, every careful glance. Long after Walter Bradock vanished from Cresmer Academy, his shadow lingered. Cadets whispered about him in the dorms, their voices hushed with awe as they recounted the night the lights went out. Instructors referenced the incident in passing, never naming names but letting the story speak for itself. During orientation week, upperclassmen would point toward the West Gate, their voices low and reverent. "That's where it happened," they'd say. "That's where the ghost stood his ground." They all remembered those 5 words, spoken without anger, without fear, without ego. "You're late. They're already gone." Those words had stopped a SWAT team in their tracks, exposed every crack in the system, and reshaped the academy's understanding of duty. Over time, those 5 words became more than a story. They became a creed, a reminder of the man who had seen what others overlooked and guarded what others ignored. At Cresmer Academy, the rhythm of life pulsed with the comings and goings of new cadets, each wave bringing fresh faces and fleeting ambitions. Yet, amidst the churn of youth and change, one constant remained: Walter Bradock's notebook, preserved like a relic behind the glass case at the security desk. It sat untouched, a silent testament to a man whose presence still lingered in the air. Ellen McCrae, with her unwavering resolve, ensured it stayed that way. She didn't stand guard every day anymore, but her visits were frequent enough to become a quiet ritual, one that the younger cadets began to emulate. They followed her path along the fence line, double-checked the locks with the same deliberate care, and lingered just a moment longer at the southeast corner, as if searching for something only she could see. Ellen's heart carried the weight of memory, a mix of pride and sorrow for the man who'd taught her to notice the unseen. Her vigilance wasn't just duty, it was a promise to keep Walter's legacy alive. Ellen never needed to raise her voice. Her presence alone commanded respect, a shift that rippled through Cresmer like a slow tide. The academy had changed since Walter's days, when brash cadets shouted to prove their worth. Now the loudest among them began to quiet, their ears tuning to subtler lessons. The ones who once swaggered with boasts now paused to ask questions, their eyes wide with curiosity rather than bravado. Leadership, they learned, wasn't about barking commands or standing tallest in a crowd. It was about being the last one standing when the chaos cleared, about holding steady when others faltered. Ellen became a legend in her own way, not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through the eloquence of her silence. Her every action spoke louder than words ever could. In the training yard, Ellen moved with a calm precision that bordered on artistry. She taught cadets to read the wind's whispers, to notice the faint shift in a shadow that others overlooked, to record every detail in their notebooks, even the fleeting thoughts no one else would credit. Her lessons weren't just about survival, they were about seeing the world with clarity, about trusting your instincts when the noise of doubt grew loud. She watched her students with a quiet intensity, her heart swelling with pride when they began to understand. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, Ellen carried a private ache. Each cadet who mastered a skill reminded her of Walter, of the way he'd stood at his post, unnoticed by most, but essential to those who knew where to look. One stormy night, during an unannounced drill that sent cadets scrambling through the dark, a second-year cadet named Thomas noticed something amiss. A blind spot flickered on the eastern camera feed, a gap in their defenses that could have spelled disaster. His pulse quickened, but he didn't shout or panic. Instead, he steadied himself, drawing on the lessons Ellen had instilled. He walked to the west gate where she stood, her silhouette calm against the rain-slicked night. "I think you need to see something," he said, his voice low but firm. Ellen turned, her eyes catching his with a spark of recognition. A faint smile curved her lips, a rare glimpse of the warmth she kept guarded. In that moment, she felt Walter's spirit beside her, nodding in approval. Thomas had seen what others missed, and he'd done it with the quiet resolve that defined Cresmer's finest. Years later, when Thomas graduated, he left behind a small note, tucked carefully behind the plaque at Bradock Post, Vermont. The words were simple: "Be steady, speak only when needed." He didn't sign it, nor did he need to. At Cresmer, names weren't necessary when actions spoke so clearly. The Academy's culture had shifted, shaped by the silent legacy of Walter and the steady hand of Ellen. Cadets still whispered of them, their stories woven into the fabric of the place. Walter Bradock, the unassuming guardian of a quiet gate, had become more than a memory. His story echoed far beyond the Academy's walls, a reminder that true leadership didn't demand a spotlight. It thrived in the shadows, in the choices made when no one was watching. In a world where noise often drowned out wisdom, where titles and accolades shouted louder than experience, Walter's life stood as a quiet rebuke. He'd shown that leadership wasn't measured by the volume of your voice, but by the weight of your actions. His story lingered in the hearts of those who knew it, a beacon for the overlooked and underestimated. Ellen, too, carried that torch, her every step a tribute to the men who'd taught her to stand firm. She thought often of the older Americans she'd met, veterans, retired workers, neighbors whose shoulders had once borne the weight of responsibility. Too many were dismissed now, their voices drowned out by a society that prized speed over substance. Yet Walter had proven that being quiet didn't mean being irrelevant, and age didn't mean being finished. Sometimes it meant being the only one left who knew where to look. As Ellen stood at the southeast corner one evening, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain, she felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. The world might rush on, chasing noise and novelty, But here at Cresmer, the steady hands still mattered. The long memory, the quiet wisdom, they were the foundation of something enduring. She glanced at the cadets walking the fence line, their steps purposeful, their eyes sharp. They were learning, just as she had, that respect was earned in silence, in the small acts of vigilance that went unnoticed by most. Walter's notebook might sit behind glass, but his lessons lived on in every cadet who paused to listen, in every choice made with care. In a world that often forgot its guardians, Cresmer remembered. And as long as Ellen stood watch, they always would.